I'm a little nervous today, and here's why. As I was preparing this teaching, the Lord decided that He thought it would be a good week for me to take some time and to confess some things to you as our people that I'm not super excited about sharing. Anybody ever had a moment in their life like that? Some things in my life that I'm not particularly excited to be talking about. But nonetheless, when the Lord calls, we respond. And so today, I, your pastor, Seth, I have been called to admit to you that I as a person, I as an individual, I as a follower of Jesus Christ, I am one who struggles with fear. I struggle with fear at times in my life. And I'm not talking about like snakes on a plane fear or something like that. Like, I'm not talking about fear of heights. I'm not talking about fear of tight spaces or fear of the dark or fear of whatever, you name it. I'm talking about the fact that in my spiritual walk with Jesus, in my everyday life, one of the great struggles that I have is that I can become overwhelmed by a spirit of fear and depression at times. I can become overwhelmed by a spirit of fear and depression. Now, it would be nice if that was where God told me to stop sharing things with you, but it's not. And so today, God has called me to specifically share with you he didn't choose a low number, 6 specific things that I struggle with fear of in my life. But first, a few caveats. If you came here today hoping for a pretty message, it's probably not what you're going to get. Because these are not things that are pretty about me. If you came here today and you were hoping for just a rah-rah message, maybe come back next week. Additionally, seeing as these are fears, these are things that are not necessarily even logical, nor are they likely plausible to occur in my life. As I've already mentioned, I have zero desire to share these with you. I have zero desire. But nonetheless, here we are. And so, if you will, here are the 6 things that I, Seth, fear in my life. The first one is that I fear being perceived as lazy or weak. I fear being perceived as lazy or weak. There's no good reason for it. That's just what I fear. I fear not being able to provide for my wife and daughter on a very, very deep level. I also fear being controlled or manipulated. Not a fan of either of those things. Maybe you are, but I'm not, in a special sort of way. There are many times, like I said, these aren't necessarily logical or plausible. There are many times where I fear that 317 Church will fail, or that we will run out of money to do ministry. I also fear that somehow, in a way that I should have been able to prevent or control or stop, that my wife and daughter will tragically die. And finally, but not least amongst them, is that I'm afraid of people knowing that I have fear in my life. It's not a couth thing to share in our world. These are the things that I deal with on a daily, weekly, monthly basis in my life. Now, the thing about fear is that fear is often something that the devil uses in our lives to make us feel like we are completely alone. It's a thing that he uses in our life to lie to us and to convince us that our fears make us worse than other people. That our fears somehow make us unknowable, somehow make us unlovable, or for me, somehow make us irresponsible. But the reality is that our fears do not make us alone. Our fears do not make us unknowable or unlovable. And those things are a lie from the enemy of our souls, trying to convince us and crush us into a spirit of defeat rather than a spirit of victory in Christ. Because the reality is that because of sin and its corruption of the human race, and its work of separating humanity from God, all people struggle with fear in one way or another. In one way or another. Maybe it's not like mine. It could be completely different. But all of us, because of how sin has corrupted humanity, suffer with fear to one extent or another. Additionally, we live in a culture, we live in a day and age that has done something, well, it's not anything new. Humans have been doing this for thousands of years, but it's become very, very real in our society. We have weaponized fear against other people. And not only have we weaponized it, but we've made this concept of fear-mongering and using fear against other people as culturally normal and acceptable. And in a lot of ways, it has led to an unprecedented amount of polarization or separation or sorting and division inside of American culture. In a lot of ways, fear has become the modus operandi of American society. It has become the baseline operating procedure of how we engage as a society. But the reality is that as followers of Jesus Christ, we cannot participate in the weaponization of fear in any way, shape, or form. That includes social media. And so I encourage you, and this is somewhat of a tangent to the main crux of my teaching, but if you're going to post something on social media, ask yourself a question first. Yeah, that's right. I love her amens of my preaching. You tell them, baby girl. Am I weaponizing fear with this post? One of the things that I see happen so often is that people weaponize fear as a form of defending people. That's not healthy. We live in a culture that has weaponized fear, that thrives off of fear. I mean, just think about even commercials you see. You'll be less than if you don't own this. They won't respect you if you don't buy X, Y, or Z. We all struggle with fear. And I would imagine that if each of you individually took a moment, maybe you've already done it, maybe it just happened naturally as I've been speaking for the last few minutes. If you took a moment and you were truly honest with yourself, you could probably name or pinpoint at least one fear in your life, a very deep, real, and tangible fear that very few or almost nobody knows about. A fear that just kind of weighs on your shoulders. It presses in times of stress. It begins to corrupt the way you view people and situations. It taints moments of joy and celebration. Maybe for you, it's different than what I fear. Maybe you fear something like abandonment. Or maybe you fear failure, rejection. Maybe you fear vulnerability itself. Or maybe you fear being judged by the cultural them. Maybe you fear being mystically canceled by some magical force that doesn't actually exist. Maybe you fear financial strife, being unimportant, not being good enough. Or maybe you fear yourself. We all have things in our life which we fear. And you, like me, have an opportunity, a choice of what to do with your fear. We all have a choice, an opportunity to respond to our fear. You can suppress it. You can hide it. You can let it leak out into your relationships when you least expect it. You can let it control you and hold you captive. You can let it make a mess of your life by not dealing with it. Or we can choose to turn to God and ask God, what do you have to say about my fear? What do you have to say about my fear? What do you have to say about how I should respond in moments of fear? Today, we're going to be looking at a passage from the book of Isaiah chapter 41, verse 10. And it says this: "Don't be afraid, for I am with you. Don't be discouraged, for I am your God. I will strengthen you and help you. I will hold you up with my victorious right hand." This verse is an interesting verse. I love this verse. But if you look at the first piece, it just says, "Do not be afraid." I don't know if you've ever told someone that's afraid, "Hey, don't be afraid." That doesn't typically go very well. It's like telling someone, "Oh yeah, don't be emotional about that. Like, you're fine." It just doesn't typically get a very helpful response. But the verse doesn't end there. In fact, in this verse alone, God gives us 3 specific promises about why we should not be afraid, or why we do not need to be afraid. The first of those three promises comes directly after this, and it says, "Do not be afraid, for I am with you. Do not be discouraged, for I am your God." As I alluded to earlier, fear is active in the lives of humanity because of the first sin recorded in the book of Genesis. It separated us from God. And in order to eliminate fear holistically in our lives, we must return into the presence of God like Adam and Eve were in his presence in the Garden of Eden in order to be free from fear in our lives. However, we run into a problem. As humans, we are not capable of overcoming our fear and returning to the presence of God on our own. It's just not possible. We cannot do it of our own accord. In many ways, we are completely powerless to return to God's presence via our own might or our own muster. This very sad and stark reality is why Christmas is so freaking important. Because at Christmas, God makes good on his promise to be with us at a completely different level. At a completely different level. He crosses the great divide of divinity and humanity, and he says that even in the midst of a separation that we created, a separation that creates fear in our lives, he will draw near to us. God himself became flesh at Christmas to restore a connection with humanity that brings us along a journey of driving out fear in our lives. And this is a journey that doesn't just happen overnight. It's a journey that we're constantly walking along with Christ. That's why we're in our series right now, With Us, the journey of a king. And we're talking about how at Christmas, God fulfills his promise to be with us in a way that nobody would have ever imagined. In a way that actually becomes flesh and blood that we can see, hear, and touch. You see, when God tells us in this passage from Isaiah 41:10, which is typically not a Christmas passage, when he tells us that he is with us, he's not speaking figuratively. He's speaking extremely literally, in that in the midst of our fears and trials, in the midst of the difficulties of life, he promises that he will be there with us. That we are never alone. We're never abandoned. We're never just left to the path of our own fear and destruction. And at Christmas time, God makes us understand how much he means this by actually becoming human. Additionally, when God says in Isaiah 41:10 that he is with us and he is our God, he's not just saying that he will walk next to us and be like, well, I hope we end up okay here. He's saying that as our God, he goes before us in an act of prevenient grace and prepares a way for us that we could not prepare ourselves. He prepares a way for us that draws us closer to himself. He prepares a way for us that allows us over time to surrender our fears to him. We'll come back and share more about that in a minute. The second promise that God gives us when he tells us to not be afraid is he promises that he will strengthen us and help us. I will strengthen you and help you. You see, have you ever been in a relationship or had a relationship that like you kind of expected the person to like provide some assistance, but instead they just kind of were like, oh yeah, hope this goes well for you? That's not super helpful typically. Like, at least in my experience, like, can you maybe contribute something to this problem? Like, thanks for the camaraderie, but like, some help would be nice as well. And in this, God doesn't just say, hey, I'm going to walk next to you, hope it turns out well. He says that I will strengthen you and help you in the midst of it. Because, I mean, let's speak honestly. We live in a world that is fallen and broken and has a propensity to tear itself apart. Just watch the news. If you don't believe me, just watch the news. In fact, I don't watch the news anymore because I can't stand to see the world rip itself apart the way it does. And the reality is that because of that, we cannot simply work harder and harder to overcome those challenges by ourselves. I mean, trust me, I've tried. It doesn't matter how much zeal you put into something, it probably isn't going to work unless God is in the midst of it. This church is a great example. In fact, the older I get, the more I realize that the less I do and the more I let God do, the better things tend to go. That the more I say, Lord, I'm not going to follow what life and the world has taught me of just like take and make. Not like Papa Murphy's or whatever. Let's take and bake. A good pizza. But I have a propensity to just like, okay, I'm going to take control of that situation and I'm going to make something great out of it. I'm going to fix it. I'm going to work at it. And I'm just going to put everything I've got and it's going to pop out nice. It doesn't work that way. Trust me. Instead, when God tells us that he's going to strengthen us and help us, in a lot of ways, he is actually calling us to surrender and submit in a world that tells us to take and make. You see, we live in a world that tells us that if we were to surrender and to submit, that's a sign of defeat. Remember, I don't like being controlled. Surrendering and submitting kind of leans itself to being controlled to some degree. And when we surrender and submit, we're going against what our culture, what our human nature, what our basic instincts teach us, that we should just take it and fix it and make it happen. And we're taught that to surrender is a form of defeat, of weakness. And that might be true if Jesus weren't involved. But Jesus is involved. And when Jesus is involved, surrendering and submitting is nothing but victory. It's nothing but a change of perspective in our lives that allows God to actually do the work that only He can do. And if we're going to be people who overcome fear through the presence of Jesus Christ in our life, we must learn to surrender and submit to the help and strength that God so willingly offers. For me, I struggle with that at times. Because like I said, and as you know, I am as stubborn as they come. And a lot of times, God has to teach me the hard way. But He's so gracious when He does. And when we learn to surrender and submit, it is then, at that moment, that the supernatural strength of Jesus Christ and His birth at Christmas, His life, death, and resurrection at Easter becomes real and tangible in our lives and equips us and empowers us to navigate the trials of life in a way we would have never thought possible. It gives us wisdom in the midst of stupid situations. It gives us hope in the midst of crushing fear. It gives us strength when we feel like we're not able to take a single step more. It guides us when all we can see is darkness. Final promise that God gives in Isaiah 41:10 is this. It says, I will hold you up with my victorious right hand. Now, admittedly, this promise is a little less overt than the other two. I mean, I will strengthen you and help you. That seems pretty straightforward what that means. But what does it mean for God to hold us up with His victorious right hand? Well, often in the scriptures, this concept of the right hand of the Father is a symbolism or a metaphor that represents strength and authority and power to actually bring about change and health and hope in the midst of situations. It's a symbol of trust in a lot of ways. And it also, as we see in the New Testament, it also refers to Jesus. Because Jesus is often referred to as sitting at the right hand of the Father. And so, when we allow ourselves to participate in God holding us up by His victorious right hand, we are participating in the promise that there is victory in the person of Jesus Christ for all of the trials, fears, and crud that life brings. And it's not just a promise of celebration, of victory. It's a promise of celebrating that we actually trust that Jesus is going to do what He says He's going to do. That He actually has the power, that He actually has the capacity, the will, the wisdom, the authority to do that which He says He will do. Because I mean, if I'm honest, in a lot of ways, fear is birthed out of a place of a lack of trust. And when I suffer and I struggle with fear and I let that fear become rampant in my life, I don't quickly and immediately turn and give give it to God to deal with, I'm in a roundabout way saying, God, I'm not sure you can make this work the way I think it should work. I don't actually trust you to make this come out to my benefit. And when we participate in allowing God to uphold us with his victorious right hand, we are participating in the victory, the celebration of victory, and the celebration of trust that in the physical person of Jesus Christ, who, as it says in Matthew, has been given all authority on heaven and earth, we know that no matter how dark the day ahead of us looks, at the end, Christ the King will be victorious. And if we accept him and surrender to him, we will be a part of that with him. No ifs, ands, buts, or booties about it. We will be victorious through the child King, Jesus Christ. And he will uphold us through the midst of all of our lives and storms. Because when we submit to Jesus, who by the way, decided it was a good idea to lead by example. I mean, think about it. If God's all powerful, he could have chosen to just tear the fabric of time and space and just step into humanity as a grown adult. He could have. It was fully in his power to do that. It would have been blink of an eye for him. But instead, to show us the way, he decides to come as a helpless infant who has no ability to care for himself, to provide for himself. In fact, he goes so far to demonstrate this to us that he actually allows himself in human form to be dependent upon humanity through the work of Mary, a human being, his mother, who would have fed him and protected him and nursed him and nurtured him. Talk about setting the example. See, like I said earlier, each of us, we have an opportunity in how we deal with fear in our lives. We can go the way of the world and we can allow fear to control us, drive us, manipulate us, discourage us, and oppress us. Or we can, especially at Christmas, we can take hold of the promise of God made real in the baby of Jesus Christ, who came near to us at Christmas and said, I will walk with you, and I will strengthen you, and I will uphold you with my victorious right hand. But the question is, how will you respond? There are so many forces in our world that try to convince us that we are responsible for making the most out of our destiny. That's a load of crap, people. If we truly want to find hope for the future, grace for tomorrow, purpose in our lives that actually gives us meaning, there's only one place it can be found. One place. And that is in the child Savior King of Jesus Christ. That's the reality. And so will I respond to our fear by following what the world has to say and just, I'm going to control it and I'm going to take hold of it, and I'm probably going to injure some people in the midst of it and as along the way, but who cares? Or are we going to give it to God and draw near to Him because He has paved a way for us to do so? Today, we're going to end with something that I don't normally do. Pretty involved activity, if you will. The host team's going to come around and they're going to pass out these little strips of note card paper, okay? They're going to come around and pass out these little strips of note card paper. And as the band plays this final song, I just want you to reflect. I just want you to reflect and to ask God what the fear is in your life that He's calling you to surrender. What is the fear, the thing in your life that's holding you captive that you struggle to let go of? That it consumes your thoughts as you lay in bed at night. And as you take this piece of paper, I just as a symbolic act of participating in God drawing near to us, I want you to write down one of those fears. For me, I've written down one of the fears I shared with you, that I have a fear of being perceived as lazy or weak. And as the band plays this final song, as you feel led, I just want to encourage you to bring that fear and lay it at the foot of Jesus as a sign of just saying, I don't know what to do with this, so I give it to you and ask you, Lord, to be with me in the midst of it, ask you to strengthen me, ask you to uphold me with your victorious right hand. I've led the way. How will you respond?